Hello everybody, my name is Tihomir. In this video I will give you an introduction to Temporal. Temporal is an open source microservice orchestration platform, and the best way to get started and get involved with Temporal is to go to our website. There you can find the documentation, community links, GitHub, and everything else. Make sure to also check out our blog and read our case studies where you can see how different companies are currently using Temporal. I like to give introduction to technologies via example. So in this video, throughout this video, we're going to work on our onboarding application. This application takes information from different patients, and depending on their location and their conditions, our application is responsible for assigning them to the nearest hospital and to a doctor that's best suited to treat their conditions. Our application can be considered a microservice, and it takes input from some web UIs we will see, and during execution we have to deal with contacting and dealing with different types of third-party services such as our hospital, doctor, and notification services. Now, this code on the left, and it's written in Java, as we will see, it can be written in different languages with Temporal, represents the core logic of our application. And the logic is, once we receive patient information, we want to assign a hospital, doctor, notify a patient giving their preferred contact method, and then do some cleanup tasks and finalize the onboarding. And what I really want to show with this throughout this video and with the demo later on is how we can go from this code, which only deals with our logic or the business logic of our application, and make this code fault tolerant, transactional, stateful, and scalable without changing any lines of code or affecting the technologies, the frameworks, and the overall architecture of our application that we have chosen already. A lot of times when we start writing code or our applications, we want to focus on our logic or business logic, which actually implements our requirements. Along with that, we always have to deal with non-functional requirements such as handling failure, recovery, persistence, making our applications transactional, and getting it ready for production. And when we start mixing those two together, oftentimes we create a complexity, meaning that our code, which initially was really focusing only on dealing with our logic and requirements, now becomes very complex, and we start actually having to put all our efforts in dealing with non-functional requirements rather than having the ability to focus on our business logic. So for application, what does this mean? In order to make this a production-ready application, we have to start working with databases. We have to, if we're talking to some third-party services, having some queuing technologies. We have to deal with timers and timeouts. We have to make our application transactional, and also we have to start dealing with different types of events. And the premise of Temporal, and what we want to show in this video, is how easy it is to integrate Temporal into your either new or existing application, which allows you then to really focus on your logic and your business requirements in your code and offload all the hard stuff to Temporal. If we look at this integration on a high level, and this video is really kind of like introduction video, and if you want to really dig into the architecture and how Temporal works, go to our website, read the docs, and there's also a lot of really good videos on our YouTube channel that go really deep into this. But on a high level for this video, in our application, we're going to kind of pick the core code or the code that implements our logic and our business requirements. And we're going to allow some temporal workers, so processes, to communicate with Temporal and host our code or workflows, as we also call them, in order to bring them the resilient part to these particular pieces of code that implement our business logic. Now, we mentioned that with Temporal we use kind of workflow terminology, and there's a lot of different definitions for workflows, and there's also a lot of different workflow runtimes, and each one has its own definition of what a workflow is. With Temporal, we look at workflows as resilient programs, basically programs that have to run even in the presence of failure and different types of conditions. Now, the best way to, in my opinion, to talk about workflows is take a look at the benefits they bring in different types of phases of our application development. So, looking at, for example, the design and development phase, um, we first, of course, have to define our workflows in some sort of language or structure. And our workflows typically fall into four different buckets. Either we can define using some flowchart workflow definitions, we can use some form-based definitions, declarative type of workflow languages such as JSON or YAML, and we can also use programming languages to define our workflows. With Temporal, we use programming languages. And a nice thing about that is that you can take any other sort of other DSL written either in XML or JSON, YAML, or whatever you have it. And those types of languages have already extra step, which means we have to translate its markup to some sort of executable code. And with Temporal, actually using a programming language, you can take any DSL that you think about using or you might be using already and translate that into executable code that can run on Temporal and have all the advantages of resiliency and fault tolerance as well that Temporal brings to you. Now, with Temporal, we have a number of languages that we support. We support Go, PHP, and Java currently, but there is a ton more in the work. And our workflow definition, of course, we use the programming language, but Temporal provides an SDK, which you can easily, add to your application. And the SDK brings you a ton of different things. It allows you to, of course, communicate with the Temporal server, but also gives you a lot of different support and a set of APIs which you can use for many different things. Synchronous invocation, dealing with different types of error handling, retries, and all kinds of other stuff that we'll take a look throughout the video. Now, the way in Temporal we define our workflows, or we can basically translate our requirements to workflow functions and also activity functions. Workflow functions really define our control flow logic. And since we use a programming language to define it, you can use a lot of different programming language constructs, such as iteration, decisions. You can define our data types, and we can also use the existing error handling provided by the programming language. The Temporal SDK on top of that provides a lot of different things like retries. We can use compensation, define compensation logic. We can define sync or async invocations of different things. Sub workflows, you can do some sort of structuring and bring the reusability of your workflows to a table. We can define queries, to query workflow execution, to signal workflow execution, and things like that. Now, one thing about the workflow functions is they must be deterministic. And what it means is that for a given set of inputs, such as data or events, we have to write a workflow definition such that it will take the same path giving the same type of inputs. And this is important because in order for Temporal to make your code fault tolerant, it needs to be able to replay your workflow in terms of, let's say, some error or some sort of failures. And it's important that during replay, we take the same exact path to the point where the failure happens, and Temporal will be able to then continue execution of your code, as in this error probably didn't happen at all. Temporal SDK also gives us a lot of different functionality to deal with non-determinism in your workflow functions, such as timeout definitions. It allows you to, for us to generate things like random numbers in a deterministic way, generate random UIDs and things like that as well. Another thing that workflows typically provide, and Temporal Server does that for us, is thing called isolation. So our workflow definition, once we execute it, we can execute it once or many times, and each workflow execution is going to create something called a workflow run or a workflow instance. Workflow definition can have a workflow ID, but also our workflow instances have a unique run ID. And what the Temporal Server enforces is isolation, meaning that one execution of our workflow or one instance cannot really influence and alter the execution of other instances. However, still, the each workflow instance can communicate with each other through things like signals or messages. Now let's take a look at our activity functions. Our activity functions are really is code that can be completely non-deterministic, and it can interact with the outside world. So in our case, for our demo, we will define activity functions that talk to the different services, such as the hospital or a doctor service. Activity functions are orchestrated by our workflow functions. They can be invoked sync or async, and they can really contain any code that you want to write without restrictions. The next phase, the development phase we want to look at is testing and debugging. And since, again, Temporal uses the programming language to define our workflows, we can really use all the testing frameworks, tools that our programming language and our IDs of choice provide. And as we'll see later on in the demo, you can also do things like mocking, where you can mock your activity functions during testing as well. Now, the Temporal SDK provides on top of that a workflow test environment through which you can use to for example, test very long running workflows in a matter of seconds. As far as debugging goes, again, you can use really your favorite IDE of choice and use the debugging features of that IDE to debug your workflows and see what's going on. Another thing that Temporal provides is replaying your workflow series from execution history. So as we'll see a little later on, Temporal provides a web UI and also has a CLI called TCTL. And through both, we can actually get execution history from, let's say, workflows that are already completed, and we can get it in different formats. And the Temporal SDK provides the ability to replay this workflow execution, also debug it, so we can actually test workflows that are already completed, let's say in production, for example, to see what went on. The next thing we want to look at about workflows is insight or visibility that workflows provide for us in different things, like during workflow execution. And with Temporal, again, we have the web UI where you can easily go and see what currently workflows are running, which ones have completed, which ones have failed. And also, as we'll see also later on, you can get a lot more information or very detailed information about every single execution of our workflows. The same thing we can do with a CLI. The Temporal CLI provides a lot more, all this information, and also you can use it for a lot more things as well. Now, we can also look through, Temporal also provides history data, which means all the workflows that have executed, we can see what actually happened. We can see on the left-hand side a summary of exactly what time it was started, what time it completed. On the right-hand side, we can dig into details of every single thing that happened. In this case, we're looking at, for example, 4 different activities that were invoked during a workflow execution. We can see an input, the results, and a lot more things like that. Another thing that Temporal provides is custom search attributes, meaning that alongside with our workflow definition through the Temporal SDK or the CLI, we can add custom things. Like in our demo, there would be things like we want to know how many patients have onboarded over the last, let's say, week, or what kind of, we want to rank the conditions, let's say from 1 to 10, according to the most kind of condition that patients had to the least, and things like that. So we can define really fine-grained and very important business level searches for our workflows as well. As far as observability goes, Temporal does have integration with things like Grafana, Open Tracing, and Elasticsearch as well. Now we've come to the cool part, or the demo. Now the demo that will show that goes along with what we've talked so far, you can find on GitHub. If you forget, after watching this video, all the steps that we took and how to, run this application, you can go to its GitHub repository and read and it has details of every single step to get you to running this locally as well. So for our demo, we have a number of steps, and all these steps kind of, are important to show how easy it is to get started with Temporal and how easy it is to add it to our existing application in order to make it completely resilient. So let's get started. The first step is, of course, installing the Temporal server. And the best way to do this is to go to the Temporal documentation. Here we have a quick install document. Now, this allows us or talks about how to install Temporal server on our local development environment. So we can either use Helm chart if we wanted to install it on Kubernetes, or in our case, we want to install it in our local Docker instance. So let's go ahead and copy this command. And here we can go ahead and get our Docker compose, and we can just say Docker compose up. Now this is going to start downloading all the things needed for the Temporal server and run it on a local Docker instance. So we can come here and go to the Docker dashboard, and we can see all the different parts of the Temporal server, and they seem all to be already up and running. Now once we have done that, we can go ahead and access the Temporal web UI that we already seen in the slides, and already have some past executions of workflow that I was running during testing, but that's fine. We will start new ones as well. All right, so let's see where we are. We're at step 2 of our demo. And now, we installed the Temporal server. Now we want to add actually the Temporal SDK to our application. And since this is a Java application that we have, and it's a Maven project, so let's go to our IntelliJ. We can go to our POM XML, and we have 2 dependencies really to add. The first one is the Temporal Java SDK, because this is a Java application, but if you're running in Go or PHP, you can consult the documentation on how to add the dependencies there as well. And the second dependency we want to add is for temporal testing. And this dependency gives us things like the testing framework that we talked about, and a lot of different things that we'll see in the demo as well. So, all right, so we're done with step 2. The next thing we have to do is we have to pick and choose in our application which parts of our code we want to turn into temporal workflows and also activities. And let's go ahead and do that. Now, our application has this class called onboarding implementation. And if you remember this code here in particular, we saw it at the beginning of this video, and this is the code that actually implements our business requirements. What we want to do is turn this into a workflow, meaning that we will allow Temporal to actually manage the life cycle of this code and make it completely resilient. So in order to do that, we can go to the code interface, and we can just say annotate with workflow interface. Now this interface basically says any implementation of this annotation basically says any implementation of this interface can be considered as a temporal workflow. Now our interface has a method called onboard new patient, and we want to actually use this method in order to, let's say, start the execution of our workflow instances. So for this, we just have to annotate it with workflow interface, workflow method, I mean, and that's pretty much it. And we have another method definition here in our interface, which means which is called get status. And what that really does is, we want to actually return the status of during workflow execution. And we want, while our workflow is executing, to be able to get the value of our status. So we can annotate that with query method. And this is actually going to let Temporal know that this becomes a read-only method that you can call either while our workflow is executing, or once it's completed. We can also query this particular workflow using its ID, for example, to get the value of our status variable here. So now that we defined our workflow, we also have to define our activity functions. So for that, our current code has this service executor implementation, and this code is responsible to actually talk to our third-party services. And we have things like talking to, the hospital service, the doctor service, and things like that. This class also has an interface. And in order to mark this interface or as an activity, workflow activity, we just have to annotate it with activity interface. And that's it. And again, similar to when we defined our workflow functions, marking this interface with activity interface annotation tells Temporal that all the implementations of this particular interface can be considered as activity functions. Now going back to our workflow, we really so far we didn't really change any code except of adding a couple of annotations. The only other thing that we have to do, since our workflow code actually calls our activity functions or our service executor here, instead of, for example, saying things like service executor equals new service executor implementation, which means we are going to handle in our application the life cycle of this particular activity functions, we actually have to use things called activity stubs. And what that means is that we have to create a new activity stub, and we can give it some information or some metadata. For example, in this case, what we're going to do, we're going to set a set schedule to close timeout. And again, this is just kind of like for demo purposes, but what this will do is Temporal during execution provides retries for workflow activities or activities functions. And for the sake of the demo, we're going to limit the time of these retries to just 60 seconds. But there is a lot more configuration options that you can actually add here as well. So what we're doing is you're getting this activity stub that would actually allow the temporal workers to communicate with the temporal server and manage the life cycle of these activities for us. The next thing that we want to do is actually start workflow instances. And for that, we also use something called a workflow stub. So it's directly invoking and managing the life cycle of our workflow functions. We are going to, again, utilize the temporal workers and the service to actually do it for us and add all the stuff, fault tolerance and resilience, and making it stateful as well. In order to kind of tie all of this together, we have a little workflow application observer class, and this class is just a framework class that listens to our Java framework startup event. So when our framework starting, our application started, this is going to be executed once, and this little piece of code just clients a workflow client. This client is to communicate with a temporal server, and we create one temporal worker to which we register our workflow implementations or workflow functions and our activity functions, saying basically anytime some sort of work or execution of our workflow and activities has to be performed, this worker is going to be responsible to communicate with the temporal server and make sure that this happens the way it needs to be. And that's really pretty much it. Let's take a look at step 4. It's now we want to actually start our workflow executions. To do that, the demo application is composed of two parts. One is our onboarding services, which is an application that starts our hospital and our doctor and notification service. So let's go ahead and start that up. So when this starts up, we can take a look at localhost 8090 and look at the Swagger UI. So our services are up, and these three particular REST endpoints represent each one of our third-party service that we want to invoke during patient onboarding. Now, the second part or the second module or application is called the onboarding app, which is the ones we just looked at the code and changed and defined our workflow and activity functions, and also our temporal worker and the factory to connect to the locally running temporal service. So let's start that up as well. All right. So when that started, we can take a look at localhost 8080, and this is going to show us our onboarding web UI that we talked about before, and we can go ahead and start onboarding new patients. So let's say we have a new patient that we want to onboard, and this doesn't really matter. And let's say we want to be contacted via text. Now let me go switch here to the temporal web UI. Now when we start submit this form, this is going to go, as we showed, to our onboarding resource, to our /onboard endpoint. Is going to be calling this do onboard method, and the do onboard method is going to create a new instance of our workflow and starts its execution by calling the workflow.onboard new patient method. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Oh, did I submit it? Nope. All right, so let's go. So if we look at the web UI here, we have an instance of our workflow running, and its status is here running, and it's our onboarding workflow. On the right-hand side, we can see the web UI is querying through the query method that we have defined and getting the status and showing it on the screen as well. So once our workflow execution is completed, so we can see here they went from running to completed. We see here the page updates with the results of the workflow execution, meaning that we have assigned a hospital to this patient, we have assigned a doctor to this patient, we have performed some steps, and the onboarding was successful. Now, if we look at this, you can say, okay, so what? Our application was running like this before. Now, and that's really kind of like, okay, but what we really wanted to show from the beginning is how we can make our application resilient and fault tolerant. So let's take a look at that. So let's go back to our slides and take a look at the next step. Now, in order to demo fault tolerance, we wanted to demonstrate, okay, what if our services are failing? What if our services, third-party services, are down and that it's actually impossible to bring it back up? Now, typically, if you're writing this application yourself, you have to deal with a lot of different things on how, timeouts, retries, and all that stuff. As I said before, with Temporal, you get automatic retries of activity, workflow activity functions. So in this case, we don't have to really write or deal with any code. So let's go ahead and simulate that. For this case, I'm going to kill our third-party services. So if we go back here, we can see that this particular, our third-party services are down. And what we want to do is, let's say we didn't know about this and we are currently onboarding a new patient. So he has the same condition. And let's say he wants to be contacted over phone. Now we're going to submit this form, which is going to start a workflow instance. But as soon as we get to the first activity, basically we're going to get a failure. Activity is not able to contact our third-party service. And as we see here, without changing any type of code, Temporal is starting to add our retry. So here we're at attempt 4, here we're already at attempt 5. So we have limited our retries to like 30 seconds. And after this particular 30 seconds, for demo purposes, we have stopped, Temporal has stopped retrying our activities. Basically, we were not able to recover from the particular error. However, our workflow execution did not fail. We still were able to complete the workflow execution. Here we see that this particular patient we were not able to onboard. So let's go back to our slides now. And sorry, the next thing we wanted to show in the demo is fault tolerance, meaning that let's say we have some intermittent failure where third-party service and can temporal help us deal with that as well. So for that, I'm going to still have the services down, so they're currently not running, and we're going to start another patient onboarding. So we have Mary. Let's say something like this, and pick, let's say, text this time. So what's going to happen now, we're going to start onboarding. Again, our services are down. Temporal is going to start using retries, but while we're retrying, our services come back up. So this is this intermittent failure that we're trying to demo here. So our services are back up and running, our retries are happening, and during the retries, one of the retries is going to see, okay, our third-party services are back up, and let's see what actually happens with our workflow. So our workflow is still running, it's issuing retries, and let's go ahead and see what happens here. All right, so one of our retries saw that our services are back up, and it's continued workflow execution. So even in case of intermittent failure, we temporal were able to actually complete our workflow execution. And see here, we have assigned a hospital and a doctor to Mary. All right, so let's go back to our slides and go to the last part, which is, let's say, a complete recovery. Let's say during our patient onboarding process, the temporal server for somehow, fails, and we really recover from that as well. So let's go ahead and see our services are running, our application is running here still. These are some errors from the retries. And let's go ahead and start onboarding a new patient. Let's give it something. All right, so now we're going to start workflow execution, and we're going to kill our temporal server completely. All right, so let's see what happens. So we started executing our activities. It's still running while our server is shutting down here still. And now what happened? Our workflow actually stopped working, executing. We're unable anymore to communicate with the temporal server at all. But let's see if we can recover from that. So I'm just going to start our temporal server again, and let's see what actually happens with our patient onboarding. So let's see if it's back up and running. All right, so as we see here, our patient workflow has recovered this failure. Temporal was able to replay our workflow to the point of failure, and we see it's still running here. So let's look at our UI and actually see if our workflow execution is going to continue for this patient named Jordan. And we're still waiting. Workflow is still running here. All right. I think this is still kind of trying. Here we go. So Temporal was able to recover from workflow history that it saved. Currently running workflow, it replayed it to the point of our failure of the temporal service, and now it's continued execution. And even in this case, we were able to recover from this failure in the complete, as we can see here now, our workflow execution. All right, so that's it for that. The next thing I wanted to show is actually testing and debugging our workflows as well. As we talked about before, temporal in the Java SDK, at least, we added our temporal testing dependency, and we can take a look at, for example, a patient onboarding test. And this test basically allows us to have perform unit testing of our onboarding system. And instead of really calling the real third-party services, in which, in a lot of cases, as we know, they could have some cost associated with it, we can use Mockito in this case, or whatever mocking framework for the particular language you want to use to mock our activity functions and still be able to execute our workflows. One more important thing that we talked about is that Temporal SDK provides is this test workflow environment, which allows us to basically run a mini temporal server locally without having to actually talk to or have a real instance of a temporal server running. So you can execute these tests regardless of if it's running or not. So let's go ahead and, and show that. We can go ahead and run our test method here. Let's see if that's going to do it. All right, so, but another cool thing that we can do is we can actually debug this test also. So once we come here, let's say we're going to put a debug for here when we start our new workflow instance. And in our actual workflow implementation, let's go and let's say maybe set up another breakpoint here. So once, let's go back to our test and say that we want to debug our workflow test. And see, we come here and let's go ahead and continue, not rerun. We want to continue here. And here now we see we're at the breakpoint. We're inside of our workflow function. And we can go ahead, and we can debug and see, okay, in this case, the preferred contact method for the user was notified via text. And we can go ahead and see, oh, we caught some sort of exception here, and we can continue our test as well. All right. So debugging is really easy using Temporal as well. So the next thing we wanted to show is replay from execution history. And if we go back to our Temporal web UI, we can go ahead and, you can click on the summary of a particular workflow instance or workflow run that in this case it is already completed, and you can get the history information as we talked about. Here you can export this in different types of formats. And what Workflow Replay allows you to do, and I have already in our test a JSON. This is one of the previous onboarding workflow runs. And you can see here all the different events that happen during workflow execution. And what we can do actually is, let's say this workflow happened in production, maybe had some issues and some errors that we want to actually see what happened and be able to debug. We can basically use this workflow replayer in the Java Temporal SDK to replay the workflow execution based on the, in this case, JSON execution history. So let's go ahead and run this test. And I see this workflow execution is passed, but really the cool thing that you can do with replay is we can go to our workflow implementation and again set a debug point here and see if we can actually, from the workflow history, debug our workflow function code. So let's go ahead and debug this. And as you can see from the history data, and while we're replaying from history information, we can actually come to a breakpoint and start seeing what's going on or what went on during workflow execution. All right, so let's go back to our slides. So that was it for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you guys have a better understanding of what Temporal is and what it can bring to your applications. Again, please check our website and I hope to see you in the Temporal community. Thank you.